going to be a very exciting game. India versus Pakistan. It's a strong rivalry. Dashrath Stadium, that's where we are at right now in Kathmandu in beautiful Nepal. And it's only the second game in the South Asian Football Federation Championship 2013. It is Pakistan to start off proceedings here. Nirmal with the long ball. And that's an own goal. What a blooper! Pakistan have just caused themselves a huge problem, and it's Samar Ishaq, the captain, who scored an own goal. It's 1-0 India.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The topic that we're discussing is, do Muslims live better in Western countries? It's a pretty big topic and has lots of different components to it. We're going to talk about it in 4 different parts. The first part of it is going to be, why do Muslims leave their countries overseas and come to the United States? And primarily we're going to be discussing why Muslims who live in the Middle Eastern region, which generally includes the Arab countries such as Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and then this could also be somewhat accurately extended to some parts of North Africa, such as Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, those countries, and then also the Southeast Asian countries, considered Asian countries such as Pakistan, India. The second part, a brief history of Muslims in the United States. So how long have Muslims been coming to the United States? What were the different stages of Muslims entering the United States, etc. The third thing that we're going to be discussing is, I guess, the heart of the question. So it's going to be talking about the economic situation of Muslims in this country, the educational situations of Muslims in this country, the lifestyle of Muslims, how they're living in this country, and how they're being integrated. And again, this is mostly going to focus on the United States. Obviously, we're going to touch on Europe, but Europe is a little bit of a different case, but we're mainly going to be talking about the question of how Muslims have integrated into the United States, and whether they're prosperous and whether they have significant opportunity in the United States. Mostly we're talking about now from a materialistic point of view. And the fourth thing that we're going to be talking about is the question of maintaining your Muslim identity in the United States, and are there any issues with that? We see that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the message of Islam came to liberate the Quraysh and the tribes of Arabia from what they call in Arabic asabiyya, which is the preference of your tribe or your family over others, or your preference to family or blood over principles. So we see that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, for example, one of the first things that he did is to bring together the various tribes and create a society based on principles, based on the values of Islam, and based on the virtues that are discussed in the Quran, rather than loyalty to tribe or family, etc. Unfortunately, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, one of the first things that occurred was that the Arabs reverted, or the Arabs in that area reverted back to the tribalism that existed before the message of Islam, and disregarded the advice of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ numerous times over his lifetime regarding who should be his successor. So Imam Ali ﷺ, or Ali ibn Abu Talib, was superior to Abu Bakr in every respect. Their argument, however, for selecting Abu Bakr was simply that the tribes of Arabia would not accept to have both prophethood, Nabuwah, which was the Prophet Muhammad Islam, and imamate or leadership of the Muslims in the same tribe, which was the tribe of Bani Hashim, that essentially the Arabs would believe that that tribe would become too powerful if Imam Ali Islam was selected, and they wanted someone who was from a tribe that was more weak, that didn't have as much standing, so that they could essentially retain the position of their tribe. And essentially the majority of Muslims, they accepted Abu Bakr as their leader after the death of the Prophet, primarily because of the orders or the dictates or the recommendations of their individual tribal leaders. So they abandoned the orders of the Prophet Muhammad Islam and of God, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the clear message that Imam Ali Islam was to be the successor because of tribalism. This has had major implications all the way from the time of the death of the Prophet Muhammad Islam until now. We see that one of the major reasons that you have, for example, refugee crises, one of the major reasons for terrorism, etc., if you examine it and go to the root of it, it goes back to this. It goes back to sectarianism, tribalism, basically people saying, we will support people, or at least we won't fight against. We will give our tacit approval, if not our explicit approval, to groups that are fighting against our enemies, against people that we don't like, that are from a different sect, that are from a different tribe, even though we recognize that those people are committing atrocities, that they're doing horrible things, we will still allow them to do those things. We won't fight against them, and in some cases they even join them in doing that, simply to preserve the position of our tribe or our group in the political order. And of course, it must be said that this is not completely as a result of the Muslims deviating themselves. The Muslim rulers over the centuries, from the death of the Prophet Muhammad Islam, used tribal loyalties and tribal affiliation essentially to consolidate their own power, and allowed groups that were aligned with them to fight against others simply as a way of preserving their power. And of course, we know that during the time of colonialism, essentially in the Middle East, essentially after World War I, when the Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed, which arbitrarily created new borders for countries in the Middle East in the 1920s, that the colonial powers, which was primarily at that time Great Britain, and then later also the United States and France and other countries, essentially supported and gave power to both religious and tribal group minorities within those societies, and put them in positions of power, essentially as a way to have a surrogate in that country that would do their bidding, that would do what they wanted, and that would pursue the agenda of the colonizing countries, usually in ways that did not benefit the society as a whole. And of course, most of the civil wars and wars that have happened in the Middle East, if you again examine them, it goes back to this issue of tribalism and of racism and sectarianism, and all of these things are essentially rooted in the failure of the Muslims to heed the call of their own religion. And of course, anyone who examines the religion of Islam or examines the life of the Prophet Muhammad will clearly see that both the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet over and over again condemn this idea, establishment of one Qibla, of one book, of one God. It is all for the purpose of having people identify as human beings and to have brothership and to have love between people, rather than to divide people or give one group preference over another because of their race or because of their bloodline, etc. So the failure of Muslims to follow their own religion is a major reason, if not the major reason, why we see the situation in the Middle East is the way it is. In a situation like that, is it any wonder that you have economic growth and development that is behind Western countries, that you have technological development, scientific discoveries, all of those things lagging far behind that of the Western world? And of course, this is a major reason why we see the poor situation of many countries in the Middle East, and is obviously a big reason why we see that Muslims are immigrating to the United States and to the West. The Muslims have been in the United States since the earliest part of the history of this country, and actually long before it was even considered America or the United States. There's actually evidence of Muslims in the United States as early as the 1500s. Most of the Muslims that were in the United States were either Muslim traders, primarily from North Africa or from African countries, or of course, unfortunately, the vast majority of Muslims that were in the United States at that time were actually brought from countries in Africa as slaves. The first traces of what we would call free Muslim immigration, or Muslims coming to the United States of their own free will, began a little bit after the Civil War. Slavery was outlawed in the United States. From that time until 1924 would be kind of the second wave of Muslim immigration. And there's not a lot of information or statistics really on how many Muslims came during that time. There are things that have been written and anecdotal evidence about Muslims immigrating during that time, but there's not a whole lot of valid statistics that are available. The third period was actually a period of non-immigration of Muslims, which is the most important thing to talk about. Generally speaking, from 1924 until 1965 in the United States, there was a lot of hostility towards people who were immigrating from non-Christian countries, even Jews that were immigrating from Europe. And we can see that obviously from the end of World War II until the beginning of the First World War. It's kind of a misnomer that the Germans and Hitler were the only raging anti-Semites in the world. Actually, even in the United States, there was a lot of anti-Semitic feelings. There was a lot of anti-immigrant feelings, with the exception of Christians immigrating from Europe. Other than those immigrants, there was not a lot of tolerance for other types of immigrants during that time. There was laws to restrict Chinese immigration. There was, of course, the famous internment of Japanese immigrants in immigration camps. And there was just, generally speaking, a lot of hostility towards non-white, non-Christian immigrants. When the civil rights movement began, that of course began to change. Outgrowths of the civil rights movement had to do with the change in U.S. immigration policy. So essentially, after 1965, there were no more restrictions on non-Christians or immigrants from non-Christian countries entering the United States. So basically the modern era of Muslim immigration to the United States, with a few exceptions in a few places in the U.S., basically started in the mid-1960s until today. So from 1965 until today has essentially been a period of relatively free access to Muslims to immigrate to the United States. And of course, we've seen a lot of Muslims immigrating, which has, had political consequences, as we've seen recently. It has been the most free and the most open immigration policy in regards to Muslims that there's ever been in the United States. And hopefully that will not change with the new president. So the Muslims had obviously reasons for leaving their countries, which we talked about earlier. And then they've been coming to the United States obviously for a long time, but mostly since 1965. So are the Muslims who are in the United States better off? The most surprising thing probably that many non-Muslims would hear from this whole lecture is that a lot of Muslims actually are much more free to practice their religion in the United States than they were in their home countries. A lot of places in the Middle East where there's very strong sectarian feelings and sentiments, and there's governments, oppressive governments, a lot of times dictatorial governments, that kind of enforce whatever the majority sect or the majority opinion about Islam on everyone who lives there. So if you're a member of a minority sect, even though you're a Muslim and they're a Muslim, but you're a member of a minority sect, a lot of times you can't freely and openly express your opinions about religion or say what you want to say. Other benefits of Muslims living in the United States versus their home countries. There's a lot more equal opportunity in the United States for women and girls than there are in a lot of Muslim countries, and that's obviously something that's been very publicized. Without a doubt, some Muslim countries, especially in the Arab world, that have laws that are very restrictive to freedom of women, even in some cases to be able to drive or to go freely in public or to get an education, to pursue careers, etc. So there are those barricades in a lot of Muslim countries. And in the United States, of course, Muslim women are in some ways a lot more free to pursue their careers and their what they want to do with their life. in the United States. And of course, as most people know, there's greater economic opportunities in the United States. We kind of talked about a little bit of the background and the reasons for that in the first part. There's also more opportunities for education in the United States than there are in a lot of Muslim countries. The majority religion in America, of course, is Christianity. It's about 80%. Most people that you meet in the United States are Christian, and Christians are also evangelical. So that's the other distinction. It's not like you're living in a majority Hindu country or a majority Buddhist country where, frankly, they don't really care about converting Muslims to their religion. In the United States, especially the evangelical Christians, which are maybe 20 to 30% of all Christians, they very much care about taking Muslims and trying to make them into Christians, and some of them are very actually aggressive about that. There's also a lot of right-wing or evangelical Christian politicians that would encourage Muslims in a lot of places to not express their religious identity as Muslims. So it's not that anyone will out and out tell you that you're not allowed to practice your faith or your religion. In fact, in the United States, there's lots of protections, as we said before, for you doing that. But it's just that the society overall as a whole does not embrace the religion of Islam as a general rule. You know, Muslims are only about 1% of the population, and the best you can hope for in a lot of cases when you're dealing with non-Muslims is that they'll just, if you tell them you're Muslim, or if they find out that you're Muslim, then you're just kind of a curiosity. In the worst case, there can be actually some hostility directed towards you. So that's why there's a lot of concern among the Muslim population about maintaining their identity as Muslims while living in the United States. So in other words, while benefiting from the great things that the United States has to offer, while maintaining their religion, maintaining their faith. Surah 5, Ayah 551. O you who believe, take not the Jews and Christians as your awliya. They are but awliya to one another. And if any amongst you takes them as your awliya, then surely he is one of them. Verily Allah guides not those people who are zalimun, polytheists or wrongdoers or unjust people. The main word that we want to talk about is the word in that verse, awliya, which it must be said does not mean friends in the context of this verse. The word itself in Arabic can in some cases mean friends, but that's not the primary meaning of the word. The translation of this word actually does have a lot of implications, but it does not mean friends. It means leaders. It means as your examples. So if we want to properly just translate the word itself, it means, oh, you believe, do not take the Jews and Christians as your leaders or your protectors. They are but leaders and protectors to one another. And if any amongst you takes them as your leaders, then surely he is one of them. Verily Allah guides not those people who are wrongdoers. The Quran in many places and in many different contexts actually encourages Muslims to be friends with and to have good relationships with non-Muslims, and especially with Christians. And in fact, there's verses in the Quran that talk about Christians being closest to the Muslims, right, in faith. So there's certainly no issue or no problem with Christians and Muslims becoming friends. Most of the people you work with are Christian, most of the people that you go to school with are Christian, etc. And just like anyone that you deal with on a regular basis, you're going to want to have a good, friendly relationship with them. Another verse that's important in this regard is Surah 60, Ayah 8, which says, Allah forbids you not with regards to those who fight you not for your faith, nor drive you out of your homes from dealing kindly and justly with them. For Allah loves those who are just. So this is something that's repeated in the Quran over and over again, is that we should have the basis of all our relationships should be justice and love, of course. The only possible exception to that is someone who is saying, oh, you're a Muslim, okay, well, I'm going to fight against you, I'm going to try to hurt you or take your property or hurt your family because you're a Muslim. Of course, in that particular case, you're going to have to defend yourself. But in any other case where the person is dealing with you in a normal type of relationship, you want to have a kind, loving, just relationship with that person. The Quran in no place discourages friendship with non-Muslims. We see the same issue in Surah 3, Ayah 28. So what does it mean, don't take the Christians as your leaders? It essentially means don't take the Christians as your example of how to act. So of course, as anyone will know, there's many things that all Christians are allowed to do, and in fact, in some cases, things that they're encouraged to do, even in their religious ceremonies that Muslims are not allowed to do. Christians have ceremony in their church where they drink wine, right, which is the communion. Muslims are not allowed to drink alcohol. Christians eat pork. Generally speaking, they have no prohibition or no problem with eating pork. Muslims do, etc., etc. So there's lots of things, areas of disagreement. And of course, when it comes to our faith, the Christians believe in a triune God in the Trinity. Muslims don't. They believe in one God. So there's areas of difference, important areas of difference between Muslims and Christians, both in their practice of their lives, or how they live their lives. There's differences in that, and then also in their beliefs regarding religion. The same beliefs and behaviors that Christians do, if those beliefs and behaviors are against what Islam teaches, because obviously they are Muslims and they should follow the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the Holy Quran and the Imams of the Ahl al-Bayt ﷺ as their examples and as the way that they should live. The other issue, of course, that this has to do with is unconscious or unthinking mimicking of non-Muslim behaviors. So even in majority Muslim communities, for example, you see this in Dearborn a lot, Muslims will act and behave in ways that are not consistent with what Islam teaches, but are very common and are very well accepted in the overall society. One of the big things, just as an example that you see in Dearborn, you see young teenage kids driving around in their cars playing very loud music that is not appropriate, sometimes inappropriate words in the music. You see both men and women dressing in ways that are not consistent with the way that Islam teaches you to dress. You see boys and girls interacting with each other, males and females interacting with each other in ways that are not consistent with the teachings or the practices of Islam. These types of behaviors that you see Muslims engaged in, there's no overt encouragement by the government of Muslims engaged in these behaviors. The behaviors are examples of blindly imitating the culture that you see around them, and it is a problem. Something is culturally acceptable in the country as a whole, but is not acceptable within your religion, then it's obviously a choice that the individual Muslim has to make. The society itself does not put any brakes or any limitations on those behaviors, so it's something that the Muslims themselves have to sincerely believe in and put into practice the dictates of their religion into their life. So in some ways, this leads to a more pure Islamic faith, because the Muslims in the United States that you see that are practicing their religion, they are generally speaking doing that out of a sincerely held belief in the faith. It is not being done because there's social pressure on them to behave in that way, although in some cases their families may put pressure on them, but they can easily get away from that influence. And the society in general, of course, encourages a lot of times non-Islamic behavior. So it does in some ways become a pretty stark and obvious choice for Muslims in the United States, and some Muslims choose to follow their religion and some choose not to, but at least the choice is clear. There are many benefits to Muslims living in the United States. There are dangers with Muslims living in the United States, in a majority non-Muslim country, and primarily that is that they would be influenced by non-Muslims and that they would take non-Muslims as their leaders or as their examples, which of course the Quran tells them not to do. Inshallah, brothers and sisters will remain strong in their faith and continue on the path of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. As-salamu alaykum.